Prison Days, Book 3, August. Written by Simon King. Narrated by Todd Waites. August Introduction. Thank you for joining me for yet another ride into the weird and crazy world of life behind the bars of a maximum security prison. I don't know what makes this job, over all the others I've had previously, so unbelievable that it warrants writing a story about. The sad fact is that, if you switch on any television these days, you're confronted with an avalanche of disgusting and shocking crimes. It's a sad reality of our community. What I find so shocking is just how accepted the crimes you read about here really are. But let's not bore you with lengthy introductions. You paid for a ride, and a ride is what you shall receive. So, hang on to your hats and let's go find us some genuine drama from behind the walls. Wednesday, August 1st. It's the first day of the month, and I was hoping for a good start. I'm rostered in Glen Elg West, a protection unit. But unlike most protection units, Glen Elg West prisoners are all on 23-hour lockdown. It's a unit filled with high-profile prisoners as well as those deemed at above normal risk. Most of the prisoners in the unit are considered compliant and easy to deal with, making the day flow with ease. But Glen Elg West is also home to Toby Manning. What can I say about Toby Manning? If I had to describe him in a single word, that word would have to be painful. Painful in every sense of the word. Born with a mid-range brain disability, Toby has been in and out of jail for over 15 years. He is aged in his late 20s and shouldn't be in prison. Where he should be housed is a disabled facility with trained professionals that know how to deal with him. Instead, the state has chosen to throw him in prison to keep him under control. He isn't what you'd call a regular crook. He just tends to breach his parole conditions and then make bomb threats and assault people. And by assault, I mean throw piss or shit on them. He is, as I said, painful. I enter the unit and find one of my offsiders already sitting at the computer. Vicky Temple has been an officer for 8 years and is a very easygoing lady. She has an obsession with golf, and unfortunately for me, a game I know nothing about. She waves as I enter the officer station. "Morning, Vic," I said, putting my bag in one of the cupboards. "Hey, how are you?" she asked. We exchange pleasantries for a bit, and a few minutes later, a third officer joins us. His name is William Loudon, and he has been in the prison for about 5 years, and much to my dismay, also a golfing nut. I groan at the lack of stimulating conversation the day has in store for me. When Control announced they are ready for morning musters, Vicky and I head around the unit, going trap to add up numbers and provide a welfare check. The process takes around 10 minutes, and Vicky calls the tally into Control when we finish. We wait for the count to be called correct, and when Control announce a recount, we all groan in unison. "Fuck's sake," Will grumbles as he and Vicky take the muster sheet and head for round 2. "How bloody hard is it to count heads?" I understand his frustration and watch as they retrace our previous route. When they're finished for a second time and we confirm the same count, I call the number in and am relieved when count is called correct a few moments later. Someone else will take the rap for calling in the wrong number. I begin to unlock the bottom-tier cells as Will heads upstairs to do the same. A few minutes later, the unit is a hive of activity, with 72 prisoners out on the floor. Some head for the toasters, others to the washing machine. I hear the unit door close behind me and turn to see the medical trolley set up. Glen Elg West, like any protection unit, has an extremely high percentage of prisoners on medication, and before I have a chance to announce medications, a long line is already forming in front of the dispensary. I grin as I make the announcement over the intercom and watch as even more prisoners shuffle into line. As I watch the line wait patiently, I begin to count, more for my own curiosity. I'm surprised to count 68 of them waiting in line. All but 4 have pills, paid for by the good people of this state. Once the meds have been dispensed, several prisoners make a beeline for us, and I already know their question before they ask. Can we go to the gym, boss? The gymnasium, because of its popularity, has time slots allocated to each unit, so as to provide everyone with the same opportunity to use it. Wednesday a.m. is Glenelg West, and almost 24 prisoners begin to congregate around the officer station, waiting for one of us to escort them. A 4th officer enters and volunteers to take the crooks, freeing us to continue with our morning duties. Remarkably, the unit noise diminishes substantially once the gym crew are gone. "Fuck off, cunt!" a voice suddenly yells from the laundry area, and I turn to see 2 prisoners pushing each other back and forth. "Guys," I yell at them, and they separate immediately. Fighting over a washing machine is one thing, but getting busted over it is totally not worth it. "Have it then, prick," the other crook yells and throws his laundry bag on the floor in disgust and retreats. Most times, crooks have a tendency to bark a lot, but when it comes time to bite, most will back down. With camera footage available to be reviewed, most know that fights can lead to further charges and an increase in sentences, and that's something nobody wants. There's the occasional prisoner transfer throughout the morning, but not really anything too serious to mention. I ask Vic how Toby Manning has been, and she says he's been bearable, mostly keeping to himself. Shortly before the lunchtime muster is called, the prisoners return from the gym, elevating the noise level in the unit considerably. They look to have had a great time in the gym and hopefully have worn themselves out. The control room calls for muster, and the crooks stand by their doors after Vicky calls it over the PA. Once they're standing quietly, I grab the muster sheet and begin to walk along the cells, completing the tick and flick. The unit is surprisingly quiet. No one speaks, coughs, or whispers throughout my trek along the tiers, and I don't need to shout when I announce for them to break off. I add my numbers, then compare with Vicky and Will. Our numbers match, and when control calls for the numbers over the radio, I call it in. After a few minutes of waiting, count is called correct, and the prisoners line up for lunch. Each unit has their own kitchen and counter from which to serve meals from. The old meal halls you see in the movies are not what happens in reality. Not here, anyway. An officer attends the prison kitchen an hour or so before each meal and collects a trolley. He wheels it back to the unit and hands it off to the kitchen billet, who finishes the cooking process in the unit oven and then sits the trays in the bain-marie. When the prisoners queue in front of the counter, the billets dish the meals out. It's a simple enough process and is carried out quickly and efficiently. If I thought the unit was quiet during muster, then I was mistaken. Now, with a plate of food before them and forks busily shoveling said food in, the unit resembles quiet time at a daycare center. Pure silence. Eventually, the prisoners finish their meals and wash their individual dishes. The kitchen billets finish cleaning up, and the shipping officer wheels the empty trolley back to the kitchen. While most prisoners return to their cells for an afternoon nap, some break out the table tennis gear, while others begin a game of pool or 8-ball. One jumps on the exercise bike, while a couple of others begin to work out on the gym equipment. A game of poker commences at a table near the officer station, 5 crooks taking places while one keeps bank on a sheet of paper. The bank is normally based on gambling canteen items and can include anything from soft drinks to toothpaste and everything in between. It's a relatively quiet afternoon in the unit, and fortunately for us, no real drama. There's a minor commotion when 2 prisoners have a difference of opinion on whether Superman or Batman should have won in the movie, but it's sorted quite quickly. Of course, Superman should have won. When we walk out of the unit a few hours later, I remind myself that any day that you can walk out after your shift is a good day. Thursday, August 2nd. I'm rostered in admissions today and work with 2 other officers in the urinalysis room. I've worked in here a few times before and always manage to have a laugh at some point. The antics the prisoners get up to in here can be quite amusing, and I'm hopeful of laughter instead of stress. Robert Nixon is already in the room and is taking inventory of our stock levels. Jason Smith is our 3rd officer, and he sits in the booth. See July edition. Our list is quite extensive for the day, having 40 names on it. There's been quite an influx of drugs into the prison in recent weeks, and testing prisoners gives management knowledge on which drugs are making their way in, as well as which units are being targeted. Drugs isn't just a community epidemic. Prisons are huge markets as they contain many vulnerable customers. Jason begins calling units with names almost as soon as count is called correct, and it doesn't take long for prisoners to begin arriving. Having them arrive quickly is often a good sign for us, as it means they are just as keen to get things over with as we are. "Anyone ready to go?" I ask the first 3 that walk in. One nods at me, and I lock the other 2 in a separation cell that sits off to one side of our urinalysis room. As I close the door, another 2 prisoners enter the area. I lock them into a second cell, then escort the first customer through. To be honest, I don't know how some of them can piss so easily in front of 3 officers staring at them intently, yet they even manage to hold a conversation whilst aiming their stream. The first crook of the morning, Dale, knows the routine pretty well, having been in prison for the past 11 years for armed robbery. He is pleasant and one of those crooks that makes the day pass with ease. I conduct the strip search, handing each piece of clothing to my offsider, check his genitals and inspect his mouth. Once finished, he gets dressed, then grabs a sample jar. He turns towards the toilet bowl and holds the jar at the ready. A few seconds later, we hear the familiar twinkle, and I give Robert a wink, who begins filling out the book. Once Dale is finished, he screws the top on and hands me the sample. I bag it and seal it with tamper-proof security tape. Once I finish my process, Dale signs the security tape to acknowledge its security, then signs Robert's book. The whole process is over in less than 5 minutes, and Dale heads back to his unit. I go to the first holding cell and drop the trap, asking for any volunteers. No one is ready, and I check the second cell with no luck. A third group of prisoners enter our area, and 2 from the 4 are ready to piss. I wave one to the side and lock the others in a third holding cell. Just as I enter the piss test room, cell 1 begins to hammer on the door. "I'm ready to piss," we hear the crook yell. "You'll have to wait a minute, just doing one," Robert yells back. There's an immediate response as a loud crash echoes through the area, the crook kicking the door. It's not something that phases us too much, as it's just a way for the prisoner to save face amongst his peers, giving us a bit of stick for not jumping to his call. We focus our attention to the current client and, like the first, is keen to get through the test quickly and painlessly. A few minutes later, he too is on his way back to the unit. I go to the first cell and bring Mr. Impatient out for his turn. He grins as he exits the cell and makes his way into our room. He begins the strip process, but I can see that he isn't quite as forthcoming as the first 2. I slow the process down and carefully check each piece of clothing he hands me. They all come up clear, and I direct him to do the rest of the dance, showing me the inside of his mouth, behind each ear, his armpits, his fingers splayed, his balls and scrotum, and all the other bits where things have been concealed in the past. To my surprise, it all checks out, and I beckon him to grab a jar. He does and turns towards the toilet bowl, the only bit of privacy he's given. The concave mirror hanging just above him is our only ability to see the proceedings, and any attempts to adulterate the sample. It's not an easy angle to keep watch, but we try as best we can. As he stands in front of the bowl, I see his hands moving about and try to see what he's up to. I can sense he's doing something, but for the moment, let him be. He grunts a couple of times, straining to urinate. We don't see or hear any urine, but suddenly holds up the jar to us. "That's enough. That's all I got," he grunts at us. Again, I get the sense that he's trying to intimidate us by giving us attitude. The specimen jar is maybe a quarter full. I wink at Robert. "Nope. Needed at least half full, man," I said to him. "What? But that's all I got. Fuck me. I can't get any more." "Sorry, man. Rules are rules, yeah?" I reply, but he doesn't like my answer. "Come on, boss," he says, turning towards me. "What's that?" Robert said, pointing at the crook's crotch, and I immediately see the issue. Protruding slightly from the prisoner's penis is the end of a black straw. It appeared that he had filled the straw with piss and then inserted it down the eye of his shaft. Once he was pointed at the bowl, he managed to massage it back out far enough to take the end cap off and empty its contents into the jar. That was why we didn't hear any piss hit the bowl, and also why there wasn't sufficient fluid. The straw didn't hold enough. The crook looks down, sees the issue, and throws the specimen jar he's still holding at me. I duck, and it goes sailing over my head, exploding as it struck the wall. There isn't enough piss to spray anyone, and Robert's already grabbing his wrist, twisting it sideways. I lunge at them and grab his other wrist as we bring him down to the floor. I hear a code alpha as Jason makes the call before rushing out of the booth and coming to our aid. Before we knew it, the room is filled with half a dozen officers, and the crook is cuffed and taken to an adjoining cell. He screams and carries on, but knows it's pointless. He'll be charged for his attempt to adulterate and probably lose some entitlements, but that's about it. Back in the room, the three of us resume our mission to get through the list. We have 15 and have 7 locked in cells by the time lunchtime count is called. The afternoon turns into a marathon of piss collection as we process one after the other. There's only really one other crook worth mentioning, and that was Ben Tassel, also known as Big Ben. Big Ben, as his name implies, is a big man, weighing in at around 420 pounds. He struggles to walk and needs constant rest when walking anywhere other than within his unit. Unfortunately, piss testing Big Ben comes with a minor issue. For one, he can't reach his dick, which in itself is almost non-existent. The issue is he can't hold his dick in a jar at the same time. Once the strip search is complete, including having him lift every individual fat flap, Ben is required to grab a jar and piss into it. He takes one from the box and faces the bowl, and thus begins a 10-minute groping dance of him trying to reach around far enough to grab his dick, and once he has a firm hold of it, to then get his other arm far enough under to catch the urine. There's a lot of grunting involved. A lot. There's also a lot of wheezing and holding breath and exhaling and jiggling this way and that. Unfortunately for Ben, there are no officers willing to volunteer to hold the cup for him. There are some lines we just don't cross. Eventually, as Ben is slowly making his way back to the unit, we tag and bag his sample. A couple of hours later, the three of us head out of the gate, grateful for the end of another shift. I've definitely seen and smelled enough piss for the rest of my life, but know I'll be back to do it all again soon. Monday, August 6th. It's a new week, and I was hoping to have a nice, cushy unit job today. But as I enter the gate, I'm asked to fill in for another officer who called in sick. Their allocation? Piss testing. I groan inside as I slowly make my way back to the urinalysis rooms. I wasn't expecting this, and normally need to psych myself up for it, but I hope for a couple of good officers to make the day go a bit easier. As I walk into the rooms, I see Robert already there. I bump fists with him, glad to see one decent officer. My hopes for a second decent officer are all but extinguished when I see Tony Malone, see June and July editions, sitting in the booth. Robert sees my expression when I see Tony, and he begins to laugh, a loud bellowing that makes me crack my own smile. Tony looks out at us and waves nonchalantly. The list proves to be better than the previous time I was in here, only 27 names on it. The only downside is that they are all protection prisoners, meaning they need to be escorted to us. If no one is able to escort them to us, then we will need to get them ourselves, and that can take up valuable time. I scan the names and see that a few of them are repeat customers. A couple of names stand out as being difficult to deal with, but we'll deal with them when the time comes. Count is called correct, and Tony commences calling for the prisoners. He lets us know which are on their way up, and 10 minutes later, we have 7 crooks in 2 separate cells. Even protection prisoners need to be separated from each other. The first customer is a fresh entry, having only arrived in the jail the previous week. He's a young kid, of maybe 18 or 19, in for sexually assaulting a drunk girl at a party. He looks much younger than his age, the other prisoners burning him at every available opportunity. I watch as Robert takes charge of the strip searching for the day, leaving me to fill out the paperwork. I act as his backup or spotter when not busy, so that we have 2 sets of eyes on the prisoners. The kid, Cooper, finishes his strip, his face vacant and nervous. He grabs a sample jar and stands at the toilet bowl. We wait for a minute or two, and nothing happens. We already know the reason, having experienced it on a regular basis with other customers. The kid's got stage fright, and judging by the look on his face, it's not likely to diminish anytime soon. "No go, kid?" I ask, and he just looks at me with contempt. "All right, come on. I'll give you a glass of water and stick you back in the cell for a bit." I lock him back up, and another prisoner bangs up, wanting bladder release. The process repeats itself over and over again. Some can go, some cannot. Some give attitude, while others just take care of business and get on with their day. It really doesn't make a difference to us. If you piss with attitude, you're still pissing, and that's all we really care about, crossing off names. And if you don't piss for any reason, then you're given what's called a dirty, which is classed as giving a positive sample. So pissing is always the better option. For those that know they've taken drugs in recent days, the temptation to try and smuggle a clean sample is almost a no-brainer, considering the consequences. Some prisoners may be eligible for parole if they stay clean, while others might be trying to gain a special privilege. Every case is different, and we collect samples regardless of reasons. We have a pretty productive morning and are able to cross over half of our names off. 16 are done by 11:30, and our afternoon should be a quiet one with only 11 names left to process. Tony calls up one of the units and tells us there are no escorts at the moment. We can either wait or go get them ourselves. Robert and I choose the latter and head to Loudon North. The unit is almost at the other end of the prison, and we have to maneuver down several corridors to reach it. We pass the gym and wave at the officers in the station as a basketball match is played out. Nothing quite like life in jail. We could hear the yelling from within the unit before we even opened the first of 2 doors. Half a dozen voices were screaming at each other over what appeared to be a card game gone wrong. 2 officers were standing in the station, watching the shouting match unfold before them, both looking flushed with nerves. They heard us enter the unit and looked relieved. They were both quite new to jail and had maybe 4 months' experience between the pair of them. "You boys okay?" I asked as we neared them. One of them grinned at me. "They're fighting over a bottle of Coke." The difference between a bottle of Coke on the outside and inside is unfathomable. Outside is just a drink that costs maybe $1. Inside, it can represent a debt, someone's pride, a prize for winning a game of some sort. If you lose a bottle of Coke to someone and you don't pay up, it could get you stabbed. You promise someone a Coke for protecting you, They could turn on you as well as whomever you were seeking protection from in the first place. You could trade that bottle for tobacco, drugs, clothes, toiletries, protection, friendship, sexual favors, or whatever else you deemed of value. Things take on a whole new level of value behind the walls. And the worst thing you can do as an officer is look at that bottle as just a bottle. See it for what damage it could do, and then act accordingly. "Guys," Robert yelled, interjecting, "what's the problem?" 4 prisoners began answering him at once, all trying to talk above each other. Robert held his hands up, waving them down. "One at a time. Stephen," he asked the closest one. "Both boys got a straight flush, 9 to king. Jack got all clubs, and Bob got all spades." "And they both think they won," another crook said, grinning. "Do you know who won?" One of the long-termers who was standing up on the top tier, watching the proceedings, spoke up. "They both won. Suits are equal in poker." I began to nod my head, pointing at the wise man on the shelf above us. One of the victors began to protest. "That's bullshit. I fucking won that." "Just split the deck. Highest card wins," Robert suggested, and they both nodded unenthusiastically, neither wanting to forego their winnings. But both agree to the new terms, and Stephen does the honors of shuffling the cards. They both split, and both pull 4s. The second round, they both pull 8s, and I wonder if a higher power was involved. Then Shane, the younger of the two, barely out of his 20s, pulled a 3. He threw it on the table in disgust, knowing defeat was now seconds away. Ken reached for the cards, a huge grin spreading across his face. To our surprise, both crooks began to jump up and down in victory when Ken pulled the ace of hearts. "I win," he yells, then looks surprised when Shane also begins to cheer. "The fuck are you cheering for? You lost." "No, I didn't. Ace, 2, 3, 4. Queen, king, ace, dickhead." I groan, wishing I could take the coke for ourselves. I look at Robert, and he's grinning, shaking his head. The rest of the prisoners that are watching the charade crack up and begin laughing, the sound sending me into a giggle. I wave at the group to quieten so I can be heard. "I've got a solution. Since you're both on our list to be piss-tested, whoever pisses more wins." The unit now breaks out into more gales of laughter, as well as some heckling. It's funny to watch. To our surprise, both prisoners actually agree to our proposal, and we escort the pair back to the urinalysis rooms a few moments later. When we reach the rooms, Jack agrees to piss first, and we lock Bob away. We take Jack into the room, and Robert goes through the usual process of the strip search, and Jack enthusiastically dances through it. "Okay, grab a jar," Robert tells him. He grabs not 1, but 3, removing the lid from each, then lining them up carefully. He grabs the first, closes his eyes, and his face becomes a solemn blankness, reminding me of a Jedi Master meditating. After a couple of seconds, I hear the familiar gush of piss on plastic as he releases. He watches intently as he fills the first, grabs a second jar, then continues. The second is filled shortly after, and he continues while transitioning to the third. The last few drips trickle into it as the jar sits about 3/4 full. Jack smiles a huge Cheshire grin and hands Robert one of the jars. "Fair effort," my partner says as he secures it. Jack signs the deed, and we escort him back to the unit, after checking to see whether Bob was ready. We drop by Loddon South and pick up a couple more prisoners whom we escort back, then wait for them to need the urge. We watch the clock, and as time passes 3, we all know that there will be no extra crooks to process today. Given that they have a maximum of 3 hours to produce, our finishing time of 6 doesn't give them enough time to meet max amount available. The 3-hour time limit is set by the hierarchy, and we are required to follow it to the letter. Prisoners are given 1 measured cup of water on the hour, up to 3 cups maximum. If they don't produce a sample in that time, they are escorted back to the unit and a positive result is noted on their file. To our surprise, Bob, who is a long-termer, asks us to note a dirty on his file and just escort him back to the unit. He can't go and doesn't want to wait 3 hours. We grant him his wish and don't wait around for the heckling in the unit when we reveal that Jack is the winner. He begins strutting around the unit with his arms raised like a prize fighter, but settles down when he sees the look on Bob's face. He's smart enough to know when to quit. As we walk out of the prison an hour or so later, I wish the other officers a good night. Today has been a good day. Tuesday, August 7th. I always get a kick out of working in visits, the place I'm rostered in today. It's different to working in a unit, the atmosphere being more jovial. I don't know whether it's because there are members of the public around or whether it's because the prisoners seem a lot happier. I just find it a more jovial place to work. I walk into the back area and check out the list of visits for the day. It's a fair number, but see that a couple of good heads are working with me, which will make the day go by much easier. Tom Grady enters as I finish reading, followed close behind by Rachel Finning. Having a female in the stripping area isn't so bad. Although she is unable to be totally hands-on, she will be invaluable running the show and also de-escalating situations as they arise. Being a happy place can be deceiving. When things kick off here, they tend to kick off quick, mostly because of how close the prisoners come to their own outside realities when friends and family visit. Our list is made up of mainstream in the morning and late afternoon, with protection in the middle of the day, just after lunch. As Rachel begins to be notified of which visitors have arrived by the reception staff, we prepare for our first round of customers. It's not long before they start showing up, most happy and pumped to see loved ones. I can only imagine the stress they must suffer, not seeing family for long periods of time, but then remind myself that they are here because of choices they made, and I push the thought aside. "Who's got me?" a prisoner asks as Tom and I stand in front of him. "You can choose your own stripper," I say, with a grin on my face. He appreciates the joke and points to me. Tom pretends to be wounded, and he beckons at another prisoner to follow him into the adjoining strip room. I conduct the strip and hand the prisoner his visit's overalls, a one-piece suit designed to restrict the ability to conceal any contraband their visitors may have managed to smuggle in. The suits have a long zipper that is sealed along the back and then cable-tied shut. It's a simple process and complete within a few minutes. We process 8 prisoners within 10 or so minutes, and once the last one enters the visits area, we are left alone to wait. "Got another half a dozen or so on the way," Rachel informs us, and within 5 minutes, another 2 enter our area. As they walk in, I see one of them walking slowly and looking down at his feet. He has his arm crossed in front of him as if holding something close to his chest. It's not the sort of demeanor you'd expect from someone about to see family. I signal to him to follow me, and he does. We begin the strip and he takes his shirt off. He appears to avoid eye contact with me, and any conversation I try to instigate is met with short, one-word answers. He keeps holding his arm as if in pain. "You okay, Brady?" I ask, trying again to get him to talk, but he shakes his head. My instinct tells me that whatever is wrong only happened recently. I go through the motions of the nude dance, checking his bits front and back. As he begins to turn, I see a small mark on his side, no bigger than an ant, tiny. I see another one further around, down by his waist. I almost shrug it aside, but then look at the bigger picture as he stands with his back facing me. A very faint bruise is beginning to bloom around each dot, and that's when I realize that he's been stabbed. I gesture to him to get dressed. "Who stabbed you, Brady?" I ask, and he looks at me in surprise. I can see the stab wounds, mate. Let me know now so I can call a code and get you help. He shakes his head, tears now visible in his eyes. I can't, boss. They said they'd kill me. No one is going to kill you, but we need to get you looked at. I see him peer through the gap in the door behind me, and when I quickly turn my head in that direction, see the prisoner in the opposite room gesturing at Brady. When he sees me, he drops his hand and looks away. Was it him? I ask, stepping between the door and Brady, blocking the line of sight. He slowly begins to nod, now visibly shaking. I don't know whether it's from shock, fear, or both, but the shaking doesn't look good. I press the duress button on my radio and call a code Mike, medical emergency. I get Brady to sit on the seat and wait for the nurses. When the nurses arrive and tend to Brady, I pull the supervisor and one of the TOs aside and tell them about the other prisoner that was gesturing at the victim. They immediately leave and head for the control room to view footage of the pair walking up to the visits building. I stand by the door and continue to watch as the nurses assess him. They call for a stretcher and ask for an ambulance to be called. Once Brady is on the stretcher and wheeled to the medical wing to await the ambulance, I head to the front area and keep an eye on the other prisoner. He appears to be visiting with a mate of some kind. They're laughing and eating chocolate as they converse. The prisoner keeps glancing over at me, then whispers something to his visitor, both men breaking out into gales of laughter. I continue to watch the pair for about a half an hour, until the front-end staff tell me that the prisoner's visit only has 5 minutes to go. I phone control and inform the soup, and he tells me that he's on his way. Looks like he stabbed him in the gym corridor. Staff are there now looking for the shiv, he tells me. I hang up the phone and quickly head out the back, informing the other officers of the soup's comments. To my relief, 3 TOs enter the area just as the prisoner returns from his visit, and they immediately order him into the strip room. I watch as they conduct a thorough strip search, including a close examination of his rectum. By close, I don't mean someone placing their eyeball at the entrance to his rectal entrance, rather getting to fully bend at the waist and spread his cheeks, 4 sets of eyes looking for any evidence of a foreign object. We don't see anything, and the prisoner dresses himself. Once finished, the TOs escort him out of the building and into the admissions area to await further developments. The police would already have been called and would arrive to assess the available footage and interview both parties. They would also take any evidence that is available, particularly the shiv that is found dumped in a bin that's located near the visits building entrance. It's a crude one, consisting of a 6-inch piece of oven rack with masking tape wrapped around its base for a handle. Brady would have been stabbed with at least 4 inches of metal, enough to pierce internal organs. Lunchtime muster is called shortly after, and once it's correct, we begin our afternoon, processing protection prisoners. There are only a few, and the afternoon sweeps by quickly and drama-free. For the most part, protection prisoners can be a lot less painful, most just wanting to serve their time quietly and hassle-free without much fanfare. Once we see the last of the protection prisoners escorted away, Rachel begins calling mainstreamers back up, and it doesn't take long for our area to, once again, be overwhelmed with obnoxious comments and loud demands. Thankfully, they're all in good spirits and enjoy their visits with loved ones. When we walk out of the prison a couple of hours later, the soup tells me the reason for the stabbing. The 2 were cellmates, and Brady had taken a shit in the middle of the night after suffering an upset stomach. Go figure. Friday, August 10th. Today, I begin a 3-day weekend, working in the dispensary on a nice 8-hour shift instead of the usual 12. This is probably one of the most favored locations for the prisoners that attend here. It's where they are administered their methadone and buprenorphine, or BUP for short. It's an enclosed area that is situated beside the medical wing and run by 4 officers. One runs the book, ensuring an up-to-date log is kept of all incoming and outgoing prisoners. The second officer performs pat-downs of the prisoners as they line up for their doses. They are also responsible for monitoring that prisoners' sleeves remain pulled up to prevent them from diverting their medication. The third officer is assigned the post of watching prisoners consume their medication and having open mouths presented for inspection after they finish. The fourth officer is backup for any of the other officers. It can be quite a volatile area, as the prisoners that attend here see this as the one highlight of their day, getting their dose. I'm joined by Patty and Thelma, both women aged in their 50s and both veterans of the prison for well over a decade. Our fourth officer is Tom Grady. We all walk in around the same time and begin our morning with a coffee and catch-up. Tom informs me that Brady had returned to the prison the previous day and was back in his unit. The prisoner who stabbed him was interviewed by the police and taken to Murray South, one of the two management units. What a way to be punished. A single cell with a TV, all meals through the trap, his washing done for him every other day. A true punishment for his crime. He would also face police charges, but they would be laid at a later stage. Count is called correct a few minutes later, so we finish our coffees and take up our positions. Thelma runs the book while Tom handles the pat-downs. I stand next to the nurse's window where I can inspect open mouths for the day, and Patty stands behind Thelma where she has a good view of the room. Thelma calls the first unit and requests their crooks to be sent up. Shortly after, we are greeted by a line of around a dozen excited prisoners, all boisterous and enthusiastically exchanging banter. They all place their ID cards on the counter in front of Thelma, then move along. Tom begins patting them each down. Then, once he's finished, they follow a yellow line that's painted on the floor. There's an iris scanner next to the nurse's station, and the first peers into the scanner and waits for it to respond. After a couple of seconds, the female computerized voice begins to talk. Please look directly into the scanner. Then, after the machine clicks as if it's taken a snapshot, it announces, Thank you. You have been identified. He then shuffles to the window, greets the nurse with an excited grin, and awaits his dose. The nurse hands him a card to sign, then a wrapped straw and a cup containing his red methadone. He takes it, peels his straw, and slurps the liquid, ensuring he gets every last drop. Then he adds some water from a jug that sits on the counter, swirls the water around the cup, and sips the rest of it. He throws his cup in the bin and flashes me his open mouth, then walks into a waiting room. Prisoners are required to wait a full 10 minutes before returning to the unit. It's Patty's job to monitor the times for each prisoner and release them when the 10 minutes is up. Not all the prisoners that come up are methadones. A few will be bupes, and these prisoners have a different course to follow. When they arrive, their first port of call is to be patted down. They are then handed a one-piece overall, and once they have it on, have the zipper that is located on the back cable tied to prevent opening it. They are then handed rubber gloves, which they put on. Only then are they allowed to attend the nurse's window. Bupe is given as a tiny strip, almost like a fresh breath strip. It's placed under the tongue and left there for 10 minutes or until it's completely dissolved. It's the easiest medication to divert and is also the most sought after. Bupe is one of the more common drugs that's smuggled into the prison. It's easily manipulated behind or between teeth or behind the gum line, and officers need to be especially switched on when it comes to bupe diversion. There are no bupes in the first lot of prisoners, but looking at the book, I see that there are 2 in the next lot. Once we send the last of the first group back to their unit, I make sure there are enough overalls available, then unlock one of the waiting rooms so we can separate them from the other prisoners. They will not only need to be isolated while we wait for their bupe to dissolve, but they will also need to be closely monitored for any sneaky mouth movements or touching their mouths with their hands. When they do attempt to divert, it's usually done in the blink of an eye. The second lot of prisoners, 14, enter the area and begin the process. Once we identify the bupes among them, I hand each a set of overalls and cable tie them shut. Once all the methadones are done and sitting in their waiting room, we allow the bupes to get their medication. Once they have their strips firmly under their tongue, we walk them into the separate waiting room and begin the observation. 10 minutes feels like an hour. Every mouth movement is scrutinized as we watch them fixedly. Thankfully, these two only have single doses. Prisoners are sometimes given double doses, each dose given after the previous one is completely dissolved. It can be a long and tedious process, especially if there are multiple dual doses in a day. Patty and I watch the prisoners as time ticks by. When the 10 minutes are up, the crooks approach us and we inspect their mouths, instructing them to lift their lips, move their tongue from side to side, and give us a clear view of every part of their mouths. Only after we're satisfied that their dose has completely dissolved do we release them from their overalls and send them back to their unit. If you think that once the prisoners have left our area, their doses have been safely ingested, then you are sadly mistaken. As I've written in the past, life behind these walls is harsh and often unpredictable. Monitoring the prisoners for adverse side effects isn't the only reason we make them sit and wait for 10 minutes. There's another reason, and it is one that we, as officers, are more akin to understand. Our hope is that most of the methadone will have been absorbed into the body by the time the prisoners leave our area. It has been noted that in the past, it's not uncommon for prisoners who have consumed methadone to be dragged aside, sometimes behind a wall, bush, or into a cell. Then, once privacy is confirmed, the prisoner is forced to vomit in a bag or container of some sort. Once the prisoner has finished vomiting, they are let go so the other party can then consume the vomit. It is, of course, one of the more extreme measures taken to obtain another prisoner's done, but the method is not uncommon. Our third group of prisoners arrive, all 22 of them. The obnoxious comments begin almost immediately as they enter through the doors, and for the officers, another round of meds begins. Most of our units are finished by the time lunchtime muster is called. Our rooms are empty of prisoners, so there's no count to be called in for us. We take the opportunity to conduct a quick search of the area and replenish water, overalls, and cups. We also take the break for a coffee and spend the time talking shit. Just the usual officer chit-chat that is about nothing in particular. Count is called correct, and Thelma calls for the next unit to send their dones, who arrive less than 5 minutes later. Thankfully, it's a quiet group of only 8 methadones and 1 bupe. They each put their card on the counter for Thelma, then subject themselves to a pat-down. Once the first has his eye scanned, he fronts the nurse and speaks to her through a tiny perspex window, while the others line up behind him. We separate the bupe, and Tom gives him a set of overalls. Once he has them on, the zipper is cable-tied shut, he puts on the gloves, then waits patiently for the dones to finish receiving their doses. Sometimes certain units can be extremely painful to deal with. Prisoners' non-stop obnoxious comments, refusals to comply with instructions, and basic bad attitude. Other units can be sheer bliss. Avoca, the boys that are currently occupying our rooms, are of the latter variety. Our last unit to be called, Maribyrnong, is the complete opposite of Avoca. It has double the numbers, has double the attitude, and the prisoners are just plain arseholes. They aren't even the happy-go-lucky, obnoxious variety. As we see out the final prisoner from Avoca, we hear Thelma call for Maribyrnong to send their crooks up. A look passes between each officer. It's the kind of look that says, "It's showtime." When the 15 prisoners begin to file in, led by an angry islander called Tui, the energy change in the room is immediate. Tui stands around 6'3" and easily weighs close to 200 kilograms. He is a bundle of bad attitude, and his demeanor is clearly one of, "I don't give a fuck." He stands in front of Tom, eyeballing him as Tom begins the pat-down. Once he's done, Tom moves on to the second prisoner, a Sudanese named Badr. Like a lot of Sudanese, he's tall and skinny, and he looks down at Robert with contempt written all over his face. Badr has a history of assaulting officers inside the prison and police outside the prison and isn't intimidated by anyone in uniform. On his last visit to prison, he hot-watered staff in his unit because they wouldn't give him a single cell, despite none being available. Badr watches me as Tom pats him down, then continues eyeballing me as he waits for the eye scanner. I tell myself that it's only 10 minutes until we see the back of them. Just 10 minutes. None of the officers speak as Tom continues pat-downs. Tui sips the last of his methadone, throws his cup in the bin, and begins walking past me, his mouth closed. "Mouth open, please," I say to him, and for a moment he just stops and stares at me. I stand my ground, looking at him in a perpetual standoff. After a few seconds, he opens his mouth and continues past me. Once he's seated, I watch as Badr takes his cup from the nurse, snatching it up without a word of thanks. I frown as I see my tax dollars get slurped up. Once he's done, he too attempts to walk past me without showing his mouth. I ask him the same as I did Tui, Badr throwing his arms up in a "what are you gonna do" gesture, and I repeat my request. He finally opens his mouth, then mumbles something under his breath. As I stand there, watching each prisoner go through the process, I remind myself that these guys are the real deal. They aren't the fictional characters you see on TV or the simple fine evaders and fraudsters you see in other units. These guys are the violent, aggressive persons you see on the nightly news who assault police, conduct violent home invasions, steal cars from people in the street, often using weapons such as baseball bats, machetes, and knives. The prisoners, now standing before me, wouldn't lose any sleep over assaulting an officer, male or female. These are the ones you need to be fully alert of, never taking your eyes off them and always remaining aware in their company. We all breathe a lot easier as we send them back to their unit, Badr giving us a final glance over his shoulder as he walks out the door. The reality is, though, we get to do it all again tomorrow. As we walk out an hour later, I remind myself that any day you can walk out of a prison under your own steam is a good day. Saturday, August 11th. Saturdays always feel different for me. I don't know what it is, considering the same number of officers come to work and the line to get scanned in is the same. It's just that something always feels different on a weekend. I guess it's just the vibe, knowing that it's the weekend. A good aspect of doing a 3-day weekend in the dispensary is that the same officers work there, so I know that the team I have working with me is a decent one. We walk in together just as we walked out the previous afternoon and go through the usual morning prep. Once our lunches and personal belongings are stowed away, we wait for the count to be called correct. It's a good practice to shuffle the duties of each officer on subsequent days, and Robert and I switch roles. Patty jumps on the book, and Robert is happy to stand by the nurse's window, leaving me to get hands-on with the prisoners. Count is called correct, and Patty immediately phones the first unit while I begin to glove up. During our brief coffee catch-up, we decided to phone for Maribyrnong first, getting through the riff-raff at the beginning of our shift rather than at the end. It turns out to be a good move, as the crooks don't look nearly as mean as they did the previous day. Tui even greets Thelma with a grin. I give him a pat down and move him along. My personal thoughts on dealing with volatile prisoners is not to give them a reason or excuse to cause trouble. I know that some officers love eyeballing them right back, as if they feel a need to uphold their own authority. I personally see it as nothing more than ego flexing, and so avoid eye contact altogether. I remain my own person through every encounter I have with them, regardless of who they are or what they're in for. I greet each prisoner I come in contact with and ask them the required questions, depending on the situation. I've always found that it is best practice to remain neutral in one's opinions, thereby acting in an unprejudiced manner. I pat each prisoner down. Those wearing long sleeves, I ask to roll up. A couple question me, but I have the same response for each of them. You know the rules. It's not your first time. Roll them up, please. They know that if they persisted with their objection, they would miss out on their little prize at the end of the queue, their methadone. There are always a couple that are nice until they get what they want and then give officers some stick once their methadone can't be taken away, but most remain constant. We happily see the last of them out the door as Patty phones for the next unit, who come bouncing in mere minutes after the last group leave. If only they would come as quick when they were called for piss tests. We restart the process, and I give each prisoner a pat-down. There are 9 methadones and 1 bupe in this lot, and I separate the bupe and begin by handing him his overalls. Once the dones are dosed up and sitting in the waiting room, I gesture the prisoner to the nurse's window to receive his strip. He follows my instructions, and just as he is about to take his bupe, I see something that raises my awareness. I see another prisoner in the waiting room make eye contact with him and raise his eyebrows a couple of times in quick succession. I know it's a signal of some sort, and immediately keep an eye on the bupe crook. There's only one reason for the signal, and that is to remind the bupe crook of his requirement, to divert his dose and keep it for whomever has ownership of it. I watch him intently, looking for any sudden mouth movements or a wandering tongue. There are plenty of hiding spots in a mouth, especially if he has missing teeth or cavities. He doesn't notice me watching and sits in an adjoining waiting room. From where I am, I can see his side profile and can only see one side of his face. If he slides the strip to the other side of his mouth, I may not see it. I see the other prisoner make eye contact with him again and watch as he gives him the eyebrow gesture. I also see the bupe crook nod slightly, as if confirming the diversion. And then, like a total amateur, he reaches into his mouth with his fingers, reaches down into his shoe, and lifts the leg of the overall to expose his sock. I try hard to stifle the laugh as I approach the room. I signal to Robert to help me, and he follows as I enter the room, where bupe crook is sitting. Just going to conduct a quick strip search, I say, and he looks at me in surprise. Why? He asks, but his expression tells me that he knows. Just routine. Is there anything on you that you shouldn't have? I ask, and he shakes his head. He stands, turns his back, and I snip the cable tie. He then removes the overalls, and I hand them back to Robert, who inspects every inch of it, both inside and out. Then he strips his prison greens, his shoes, and finally his socks and shoes. I hand the shoes back to Robert, then inspect each sock. Hidden in one of them is a half-dissolved strip of bupe. I hold it up, and the crook frowns, his eyes glancing over my shoulder. Don't worry about them. They can't see us, I say, knowing who he's looking for. The soup will let you know what happens from here. Ever been caught diverting meds? I ask, and he shakes his head a second time. All right, no worries. You can return to your unit. I hand him his socks, and he begins to dress. As I walk past the waiting room door holding the dones, I look in and am greeted by a very angry-looking eyebrow raiser. Once all the prisoners have left, I phone for the supervisor of Tambo East and inform him of the diversion. I also alert him to the other prisoner that was gesturing to the diversion. The information is important because it helps identify crooks that have a tendency to stand over weaker prisoners. The soup will also notify the intelligence unit, who will note it down and keep it on file. One thing that will be high on the priority list is to ensure the safety of the prisoner caught diverting. He may face retribution for those after his bupe, and it's our duty to ensure his safety. We continue our work until lunchtime count, and we all enjoy a quick chin wag and a cuppa. It can get quite exhausting when you are focused and alert for hours on end, and it's a real luxury when no prisoners are around. The afternoon goes quite smoothly, and the good news is that it's just a run-of-the-mill afternoon. We finish shortly after 2 o'clock and head home. Today has been a good day. Sunday, August 12th. Sunday always feels more relaxed than any other day of the week, even Saturdays. And the best thing about Sunday? The breakfast cook-ups. Most units throughout the prison will have their cook-ups with each officer assigned a specific ingredient, depending on what everyone chooses to make. There's always a selection of bacon, eggs, mushrooms, avocado, pancakes, pikelets, waffles, sourdough bread, tomatoes, fresh fruit, hash browns, and a selection of juices. I mean, seriously, are you hungry yet? I bring in a bottle of orange juice and a bottle of apple juice, while Robert brings bacon and eggs. Patty has a bag of freshly sliced mushrooms, avocado, and tomatoes, while Thelma brings a deliciously thick-cut sourdough loaf. As soon as we arrive in the dispensary, I turn on the frying pan and prep the ingredients. I love cooking, and I'm usually the one tasked with it. Half an hour later, we're all chomping on bacon and egg sandwiches with a variety of sides. There isn't a lot of conversation in the tiny kitchenette as we fill our mouths with breakfast goodness. We all love our food and know that this brief moment of culinary bliss is only a tiny bubble when compared to the rest of the week, and we intend to make the most of it. Count is called correct at 8 a.m., but none of us are in a hurry to call any units. We have priorities, and the prisoners aren't it. Other units will be going through the same process as us, so no one annoys anyone else during this time of food tranquility. It's a little before 9 by the time I swallow the last of my breakfast. I wash it down with a mouthful of OJ and toss my dishes in the bin. Another bonus. No dishes to wash. We spend a few minutes cleaning the things we used, then pack the leftovers up and stow them in the staff fridge. There is sufficient for lunch and maybe then some. I wish I had something exciting to share with you today, but even the crooks see Sunday as a day of relaxation. Not a lot happens, and we process the units by 2 o'clock. The only minor thing that happened was a code mic just after lunchtime muster. A prisoner slipped in the shower and had to be taken to hospital by ambulance. His so-called slip gave him a fractured right eye socket, a loose tooth on his left side, and a cracked rib that was also on his right side. Those shower stalls can be deceivingly bouncy. When officers reviewed the footage, it revealed 3 prisoners entering the injured crook's cell just before the so-called fall. All 3 will face charges in the coming days. But for us, today was a good day. Thursday, August 16th. After working the weekend, I have a short week to work consisting of just 2 days. Sometimes it really does pay off working in a prison. The rosters are pretty awesome. Today, I'm working in Tambo West. Stephen Jacobs is already sitting in the officer station as I enter the unit, and I'm about to greet him when I see the 3rd officer of the day coming out of the toilet. My heart sinks seeing Tony Malone wave at me as he walks back to the station, not bothering to look at me. I wave back unenthusiastically and take my bag to the staff room. There are some places in the prison where you don't mind working with someone like Tony. Don't get me wrong. I don't not like him for mild or petty reasons. His demeanor and his abrasive attitude is just not suited to places like Tambo West. When he works in the urinalysis area, reception, the medical unit, or places of low prisoner flows, he can be quite useful. But here, in a volatile mainstream unit, a place filled with angry prisoners who have so many weapons hidden and have kettles ready to boil bucket loads of boiling water? I'd rather work with Charles Manson standing beside me. Unfortunately, some people are not only a danger to themselves, but also to the officers working beside them. Once my things are packed away, I head back to the station and shake hands with my compadres. Take a quick look at the unit roster and see a few familiar names. Mainstream units can be divided by several factors, but most notable is which gangs each unit comprises of. Warring bikie gangs can be sent to specific units to keep them separate. Some units can be predominantly Islanders, Asians, or African gangs. Some units can be a mixture, such as this one. I notice one name in particular that surprises me. Badr, the methadone crook from Maribyrnong. It seems he was transferred overnight for reasons yet unknown. I check the handover log and find that it hasn't been filled in for the past week and a half. It truly astounds me how officers can work in a unit for a day, then give the next day's staff absolutely no information as to what's been happening, such as observations, transfers, codes, or any sort of tension. A well-worded handover means the incoming officers can have their facts right before unlocking 6 prisoners for 12 hours. Without one, you may as well send them into the unit blindfolded. "You want to take the clipboard?" Tony says to me, and I nod, following him as control calls for morning numbers. He opens each trap and calls the number of prisoners in each cell to me. I also note that he doesn't greet any of them as he conducts his checks. Like I said, abrasive. When we finish the last cell, Tony heads back to the station as I count up the numbers. When I get back to the station, I note the final number from the previous night, matching the two. This morning's number is one higher, and I remind myself of the overnight transfer. I call in the number and we wait for the count to be called correct. "Attention all stations, count is correct at 8:02, Control calls a short time later, and I head for the upper tier to unlock the cells. Steven unlocks the lower tier, and before long, prisoners are filling the unit. Washing machines begin to whir, toasters begin to pop, and the chatter builds. Monday morning can be quite busy, especially if the weekend staff were all blow-ins, not regular unit staff. I hadn't checked the previous day's muster, but when I do, I'm surprised to find out that regular staff were in fact rostered in the unit. Surprised because of the lack of handover notes. If the prisoners weren't angry enough before, they certainly are after I tell them that the gym was closed for the day. According to my emails, there had been an incident in the unit the previous day, and as a consequence, the soup had canceled gym time. An officer had been shit-bombed by an unknown prisoner huddled amongst others as he exited a routine cell search. When the perpetrator failed to come forth, the soup canceled gym for the rest of the week, a hard-hitting consequence to those that use it religiously. It could also prove to be a painful decision for the person responsible, as retribution can be swift. The only good thing I can gather from the soup's email is that the staff from the previous day would have already told the crooks the gym consequence, so I knew that the surprise and anger they were now displaying was purely just for a bit of theater. The med trolley arrives for morning meds, and Steven makes the announcement. He also heads for the med room and begins chatting to the accompanying officer. The prisoners immediately begin to line up in anticipation of their pills. The phone rings, and when I answer it, I'm greeted by Gary Hansen from the urinalysis room. He's after 2 prisoners from the unit, and a quick check of the muster confirms their presence. One I already knew. The second I check for. I look around and see both sitting at a table near the station. "Badr and Adonis, need to go to admissions, lads," I say to them, and they both look at me suspiciously. "What for, boss?" Adonis asks, but I shake my head. "They don't tell me those things," I reply. I know some officers happily tell prisoners that they're required for a piss test, but it only makes it harder for everybody. The first port of call for a crook, after finding out he's required for a piss test, is the water tap in his cell, and they will stall for as long as possible. The other department that is within admissions, a department that is popular with crooks, is property. It's where they can obtain any special buys that they've ordered, such as new runners, stereos, fans, and whatnot. So if they have a current order in the system, they almost skip out of the unit to get their purchase. I can see the two of them whispering to each other, both glancing in my direction. "Now, boys," I repeat, and they begin to move. I fill out their movement slips and they head out. They pass Stephen, still chatting to the other officer as the prisoners continue receiving their meds. I look across and frown at Tony, who's sitting on the other side of the station, reading a newspaper. Once the med trolley leaves, the usual myriad of activities slowly commence around the unit. A card game here, table tennis, a game of pool, board games, and of course the fitness equipment. Every unit has at least a treadmill, an exercise bike, and a home gym. Everything is used and used well. The home gym, normally a hive of activity, as prisoners vie for a spot. There are a lot of duties to complete as an officer as well. Apart from monitoring the unit, there are tier walks to conduct, as well as random cell searches, unit musters to update, prisoners to move along, and their newly available single cells to allocate, cells prepped for new incoming prisoners, file notes to write, the daily routine of musters, medical appointments, classes, and work allocations. It's a never-ending lineup of jobs that stretch from morning to night. I look at the list of moves for the day and see there are 3 prisoners leaving our unit, 1 who's being transferred to another prison, and 2 who are moving to another unit. I show the names to Stephen, and he calls the transferring prisoners to the station and informs them of the moves. They all happily wander back to their cells and pack up. Outgoing moves happen in the morning, while incoming moves are an afternoon activity. As if on cue, prisoners begin to arrive at the station as soon as the 3 prisoners exit our unit, all asking the same question: who gets to move, as 2 of the 3 cells are single. I bring up the current single-cell waiting list and hold it up for all to see. A mix of groans and cheers erupt in the group as the winners view their names, quickly running to pack their belongings. I can only imagine the sheer relief it must be to go from having to share a cell to getting a single. To be able to shit in peace, sleep in peace, choose what to watch on TV without having to consider someone else. The relief is written all over their faces. There's a code Alpha called over the radio at that moment, and before any of us can react, it stood down by the soup. It was in the urinalysis room, and I'm not surprised when they called to say that Bader wasn't going to be returning to the unit. He'd filled a specimen jar, then flung the urine into the officer's face for telling him to hurry up. The TOs happened to be walking through the area and had taken the prisoner down with minimal resistance. Having Bader not return to the unit only adds to our workload, as we are now responsible for his belongings. If he had been sharing a cell, we would be required to attend the cell immediately and pack his things before it's all stolen by other prisoners. But as he was separated the previous night, I simply lock his cell door until a more suitable time comes around. He wouldn't receive his personal stuff for a while anyway, as he would be placed in the slot, limiting his personal belongings. When I return to the station, the radio comes to life again as a code mic is called in Yarra North. A lot of code mics are nothing more than crooks trying to bail out of their unit. Most of the time, the nursing staff turn up, perform their assessments, and see through the prisoner's facade, giving them a couple of painkillers and leaving them in the unit. The code is stood down a few minutes later, and we continue with our day. Lunchtime muster is called a short time later, and the 3 of us conduct it with relative ease. One prisoner refuses to stand by his cell door, and when we call the unit to break off, call him down to the station. When he refuses, Stephen and I head up the stairs to confront him in his cell. His name is Kurtz, and he begins swearing at us the moment he sees us at his door. We're unsure of why he's upset, and as he makes a lunge at us, Stephen slams the cell door home, leaving the crook with no option other than to kick the shit out of it to save face, which he now does. Stephen and I know only too well that this could also be nothing more than an attempt to bail by confronting an officer and getting into an altercation. Bails can happen for the silliest of reasons, but can have severe consequences. I've read the reports and listened to officers that have been attacked for no reason other than a prisoner wanting to bail out of a unit due to debts or fear. The rest of the afternoon plays out like any other day. We conduct 3 random cell searches, which turn up nothing noteworthy, as well as receive our 2 new transfers, allocating each a new cellmate. The workers begin to return to the unit later in the day, and the main area grows more livelier as more prisoners join in the fun. The afternoon med trolley arrives just before count, and Tony finally lifts his rump off the seat and supervises the pill dispensing. I'm relieved when we finally walk out a couple of hours later. Although we basically ran the day with only 2 officers, we completed everything we needed to and can walk out knowing we worked hard. Today was a good day. Friday, August 17th. Today I was rostered in Tambo East, and when I arrived in the unit, saw Tony Malone sitting in the officer station. We shook hands as I entered the station, and after I put my things away, checked my emails. Our 3rd officer, Paul Bennett, entered the unit a short time later. They didn't greet each other. Instead, Paul grabbed the clipboard and beckoned me to follow. "Can you drop traps?" he asked, and I was happy to oblige. When we finished and were back in the station, there was very little talk while we waited for count to be called, and I could sense something brewing between my 2 offsiders. Whatever it was, I hoped that they were professional enough to keep it outside of work, as it's bad practice to show prisoners anything but a united front. Count is called correct about 10 minutes later, and I head out to commence unlocking the cells. Tony remains sitting in the station, blank-faced. Paul looks at him for a moment, then shakes his head and heads for the top tier while I unlock the bottom. Within minutes, the unit is a bustling throng of activity, as prisoners exit their cells and begin their morning rituals of breakfast, laundry, catch-ups, and officer pestering. The latter is normally prisoners itching to get to the gym, and this morning is no different. I begin to write movement slips for around 20 prisoners, and once finished, watch as they exit the unit in an excited group, looking like a bunch of kids off to a movie cinema or carnival. As they exit, I see the medical trolley arrive and enter the unit dispensary window. I'm about to greet it when I spot a handwritten note sitting on the counter in front of me. It takes my interest because it's not uncommon for prisoners to drop notes on each other. When a prisoner drops a note, it's taken quite seriously because it's an anonymous way for prisoners to give officers handy bits of information. Most of the time, notes are written to inform officers about a prisoner that is bound to be stabbed if he remains in the unit. This is one of those notes, and concerns a crook by the name of Jester Williams, a young 22-year-old in the unit for burglary and assault. I check his file, and it looks like Jester has only been in the unit for a few days. Some prisoners can be targeted by other prisoners because they are weaker, are accumulating debts for protection, drugs, or canteen, or are trying to stand over other prisoners. Jester, however, is none of these, and judging by the tone of the note, could be in a lot more danger of retribution if the threat is real. The note doesn't go into specific details, but what it does say is pretty clear. Jester attacked my friend's mother on the outside, and if he stays in the unit, he'll get stabbed. I check the muster sheet and see which cell Jester is in, and see if he's sharing with anybody. The unit muster shows him to be in cell 38, and in a single cell. 38 is on the top tier, and I look up and see the cell door still closed. I ask Tony to go up and lock Jester in, showing him the note, while I phone the soup. He looks at the note, reads it, then grins. "That's a shame. Bash a crook's mother and then end up in here with them," he says. He doesn't move and for a moment looks as if he has no intentions of going. I look at him, raising my eyebrow, and he finally moves. As he ascends the steps, I phone the soup and wait to be answered. Just as Tony reaches the top of the stairs, there's a sudden loud screaming from the end of the tier, and I look to see a prisoner running from the open door of cell 38, a bucket in one hand. I reach for my radio but hear Paul already calling a code foxtrot. Tony stood frozen at the top of the stairs, apparently unable to move, as I call for the unit to go into lockdown. I don't need to use the PA, as my adrenaline is charged enough to amplify my voice. Most prisoners remain where they're standing, and I holler a second time as I run up the stairs, agonizing screams coming from the cell in question. Paul begins to lock crooks into cells as I run towards Jester's cell, cautious of any wayward feet that may be intentionally stuck out to trip me. When I reach cell 38, Jester is sitting on his bunk, his hands held out in front of him as if admiring his nails. To my horror, I see that it wasn't just a simple case of getting hot-watered. The bowl of boiling sugar syrup had hit him square in the face and then run down his naked torso, coating every inch of his skin with a sticky gloop that began to instantly burn and solidify. He'd tried to wipe the syrup from his eyes, but only managed to rub the melting skin clean off. His forehead, nose, and cheeks were all now little more than exposed muscle tissue, the skin dangling down in long strips. He was trying to scream, but there was no voice, just hollow chokes coming from deep within his chest as if his tongue had been ripped out. As I entered the cell, I could actually hear prisoners laughing behind me, totally amused by the permanent scarring this kid had just received. The sweet smell of the syrup filled the tiny cell as I watched Jester shaking uncontrollably, his skin almost mirror-like. Without thinking, I turned the cold tap in the shower on and grabbed his hand, pulling him to his feet and pushing his face beneath it. "Don't touch your face," I yelled at him, and when he tried to reach up again, I held his hands down. One prisoner poked his head in through the door and gave an animated giggle. His head suddenly disappeared as Paul grabbed him from behind and pulled him back out, ordering him to his cell. They stood eye to eye for a moment, before the crook backed down and walked away, still grinning. When the staff arrive a minute or so later, the rest of the unit is finally locked up, and to my surprise, see Tony back in the officer's station. He'd failed to back either one of us up. The medical staff arrive moments later and immediately begin to work on Jester. An ambulance is called, and there is an eruption of banging and door kicking as he is wheeled out of the unit. Loud cheers accompany the banging, as well as shouts of dog, rat, and mutt. As I go back to the station, I confront Tony, sitting in one of the chairs. "What the hell was that? No backup?" He looked at me like I'd taken a piss in his cup of tea. "I hurt my ankle on the stairs," he replied, but I could see he lacked the conviction to believe in his own lie. Unfortunately, arguing gets us nowhere, and I sit at the computer in disgust and begin typing my report. It's all I can do to stop myself from simply screaming my frustrations at him. When I finish my report, I email it to the soup, then head back upstairs and go to cell 38, still standing open. There are no other officers besides us, and there's no reason to keep it open, especially with the gym crooks due back in an hour. I lock the cell and answer a couple of trap taps as I walk past. It's the normal questions you'd expect. When are we being let out, and how long are we locked up for? The usual stuff. No one asks about Jester's welfare, and it doesn't surprise me. For the most part, a lot of them don't care, and those that do won't stick their neck out to highlight the fact. The gym crooks arrived back in the unit just after 10, already aware of what had transpired in their absence. The prison telegraph line works very well in these types of situations, sometimes more efficiently than phone calls between officers. They were all still excited, and as we lock each away, ask when the unit will be unlocked. That question is answered when the soup rings a short time later. The unit is to remain in lockdown and wait for the arrival of police, who will conduct an investigation into the assault. The lockdown remains in place for the rest of the day. The police officers don't arrive until after lunchtime muster and stay until just after 6. We deliver meals to the cells via their traps and escort the nurse to those that require medication during each med run. The prisoner responsible for the assault is removed from the unit and taken to the admissions area to await transfer to another unit, but I don't find out which. I walk out alone at the end of the shift. For one thing, I'm still pissed off at Tony for his lack of backup. Paul was still in his mood from the morning, and I don't know the reason for his beef with Tony. I'm not interested, as I have enough on my plate trying to deal with him myself. Monday, August 20th. Was called in for overtime and got to work in the urinalysis room again. You know how some days you come to work and you just know that you're going to have a shit day? Today was not one of those days. Today was one of those days where you just feel the sunshine in the air and the positive energy from all those you come in contact with. Miguel Foster is my main offsider today, and Chris Upton is sitting in the booth. Both are funny guys to work with, and their positive energy and sense of humor is something that makes the day a real pleasure to get through, despite our surroundings. Although we have a substantial list of names to get through, having these guys beside me is half the battle won. I won't bore you with every single prisoner we piss tested, as there really isn't that much to tell. There were 2 moments worth mentioning, though. The first was when we tested a regular junkie named George Blakely. He's in his early 30s and has been in and out of jail since his early teens. He's also a regular meth user, and, given his current mental state, may have actually fried his brain the last time he was out. Prisoners whose brains are completely fried from drug use can be extremely unpredictable and need to be treated with extra caution. Miguel had gone to answer the door knock coming from George's cell, and when told that George was ready to piss, unlocked the door. George came into the piss room and went through all the requirements for the strip test. Once he grabbed the jar, he lined up in front of the toilet and put the jar on the shelf above the sink. Then, as if polishing some ornate copper vase, he spat into the palm of his hand and began polishing the knob of his dick. "George, what are you doing, bud?" Miguel asked. George looked at him groggily, then smiled. "I need to warm it up. Can't piss without warming it up," he replied, looking at Miguel vacantly. Miguel shot me a glance, but I just shrugged. George was rubbing the head faster and faster, and for a moment, I thought he was going to give us a white sample instead of yellow. But when he grabbed the jar and began to trickle piss into the jar a few moments later, the look on Miguel's face was gold. I struggled to contain my laugh, not wanting to wind George up, but bellowed with both my offsiders once the crook was safely back in his cell. It was the strangest method of pissing I've seen, to date. The second noteworthy incident came from a prisoner called Eugene Prince. He was a relatively new prisoner, aged in his mid-20s. He'd arrived with a group of prisoners and then put into a cell with 2 others. Miguel and I processed prisoners as they needed to piss, and when it came time for Eugene to be processed, let him into the room. As I was conducting the strip searching for the day, I gestured Eugene onto the mat and faced him. He began to remove his clothes, 1 piece at a time, and when he removed his jocks, the 3 of us began to choke on fits of laughter. Eugene just stood there, red-faced and wide-eyed. After a few seconds, another officer peeked in at us, curious about the roaring gales of hilarity. Once he saw what we were seeing, he also began to cackle. "What?" was all the crook could bring himself to ask. He was standing before us, naked, his hands cupping his genitals. It wasn't his genitals we were laughing at. What had tickled our funny bones was the carefully tied finger that he had cut from a rubber glove and had filled with a clean urine sample, probably purchased from one of his unit buddies. He had tied a piece of clear fishing line around it and then tied it around his waist. As he was standing in front of us, the urine-filled finger was dangling in mid-air between his legs, looking like a magician's floating finger trick. It looked as if he'd tried to sticky tape it behind his ball bag, but the tape had loosened, leaving the finger dangling beneath him. Once he got his laughter under control, Miguel pointed out the obvious. We confiscated the finger, expelled the urine, and put it into evidence. The prisoner was charged and returned to his unit. The rest of the day went without a hitch, and we completed all the required tests we were tasked with. We were still laughing when we walked out later that afternoon. Today was a good day. Tuesday, August 21st. Writing about the day that was today makes me shudder with revulsion. I have never, I repeat, never, been as repulsed as I was today. Some prisoners just have that kind of effect on people. Let me explain. Today, I was rostered in the medical unit. It houses prisoners that require ongoing medical attention, or those who are too frail to be housed in a unit because of their inability to look after themselves. There are approximately 40 cells, each housing as many as 3 prisoners, depending on their needs and classification. A total of 4 officers man the unit, with duties including searching cells and prisoners, as well as escorting nursing staff on their rounds. Mainstream prisoners are still kept away from protection prisoners by remaining locked in cells until each classification is given their runout. Generally, either protection or mainstream are given a runout in the morning and the other in the afternoon. Each subsequent day is rotated, so prisoners are given alternating times with which to use the outside choke pen. Today, I had the pleasure of Ricky and Thelma to help me, as well as a quiet man called Vincent Tremaine. The medical unit is seen as a pretty quiet area of the prison, and not a lot of excitement happens. There can be the occasional altercation about medications and dosages, but generally speaking, it's a pretty good area to work. Or so I thought. The medical wing also houses a number of monitored cells that have active cameras monitoring each prisoner they contain. These cells are normally utilized to monitor prisoners that have been deemed a risk to themselves and thus put on suicide watch. Suicide watches are classified by the severity of the prisoner's threats of self-harm and are called S1, S2, S3. S1 requires a prisoner to be monitored and physically viewed every 15 minutes. S2 is 30 minutes, and S3 is every hour. Having a number of S watches can make or break the day, depending on how active the watches are and how serious their threats are. A lot of the time, prisoners use suicidal threats as a form of bailing from a unit. Others use it as a way to get attention, or to simply be a pain in the arse. Some, however, can be quite serious and have to be monitored to ensure their safety. As I enter the wing, I'm greeted by Ricky and Thelma, already setting up for the day. I see a familiar yellow folder on the bench in front of them. It's a suicide watch folder. I head straight for it, looking at the name and the classification. It's an S1, which isn't good, but not what gives me instant dread. What deflates me of every bit of positive energy I had walking in is the name at the top of the page, Robert Coleman. Thelma and Ricky see my shoulders slump and giggle a little. Painful is the only word that accurately describes Robert Coleman. Robert Coleman is a long-term gay prisoner, aged in his mid-60s, that is mostly housed in protection units. By gay, I don't mean any disrespect. The reason it is of importance to know of his sexual orientation is because Robert not only likes to provide sexual gratification to willing prisoners, but he also likes to keep semen samples in a row of named cups on his windowsill. He's also the carrier of hepatitis, venereal disease, and AIDS. Whenever I know that Robert is in a unit, I know to keep a pair of disposable gloves very close. I put my things away while waiting for count to be called correct, and when I come back out to the station, see Vincent sitting quietly off to one side. I greet him and shake hands, asking about his family. He smiles and tells me about his 6-year-old granddaughter's weekend birthday party. As he finishes telling me about the wonderful cake his daughter made, Control calls count correct, and I begin to unlock the mainstream prisoners' cells. Thelma is already busy on the intercom, talking sternly to Robert Coleman, who is adamant that he was due to be released today, and if we don't let him go, he would sue all of us. He also wanted to know when his bucket of KFC would be delivered, as he'd ordered it quite some time ago. The mainstreamers begin to exit their cells, with most heading for the choke pen. The sun is out, and most are looking at a quiet chat in the sunshine. Some sit and watch TV, while a couple of others remain in their beds. A nurse comes out from their station and asks for an officer to accompany her on her rounds, and I happily volunteer. Unlocking cells and standing by as the nurse attends each of the patients is quite a simple task that doesn't involve much effort. A few of the prisoners offer some conversation, and I happily respond. As I unlock each cell, the same mixture of damp sweat, bed farts, and industrial cleaner hit my nose, and I try and stand just inside the doorway, out of the breeze. None of the windows open, for obvious reason, and with the aircon switched off, airflow is kept to a minimum. But smell is a funny thing, as it's only really noticeable for a few seconds before your body becomes used to it. At least, that's what I thought. Once the nurse is finished visiting the patients, I return to the station where Thelma is still engaged in conversation with Robert. He's still wanting his KFC bucket, but is now also wondering where his lawyer is. Getting fed up with his constant buzzing, Thelma tells him to stop pressing the intercom or he will be disciplined. He doesn't care. As soon as he hears the connection break, he presses the intercom button again, forcing us to answer. All voice traffic is monitored, and you do need to watch what you say, especially as he is an S1. The day was going along absolutely wonderful. The sun was out, there was good conversation between the officers, the crooks were happy. And then, in a split second, it just all went to shit. Literally. Robert stripped naked and waved his canvas gown around like a checkered flag, cheering loudly as if riding a horse in a rodeo. Then, just as we were getting ready for lunchtime count, he squatted in the middle of his cell and took a shit. A decent one, too. He was still buzzing up as soon as we hung up, and as soon as he dropped his crap, pressed the intercom button and asked us to come and smell. When we refused, Robert decided to use some of his feces as hair wax, giving himself a head full of short spikes. But that wasn't what bothered us. What he did next did. Robert turned the shower on and plugged the drain with his canvas gown. Prisoners flooding their cells is not uncommon, occurring at least once or twice a week. But when you have feces mixed in, as well as a prisoner that is diseased, things get a bit dicey. Just as we were about to call the soup to get the water turned off, a code alpha was called. The officer sounded distressed, and two of our officers ran out to help, Vincent and Ricky. I was in talking to the doctor about the dangers for us from the flooding when the call came through and thus remained while the other two bolted. Less than 30 seconds later, a code Charlie was called. A code Charlie is an order to lock down the entire prison. It's mainly called when resources may be stretched thin and unable to respond to a second incident if one was to be called. I began to lock the mainstreamers back into their cells, securing our wing. As I returned to the station, a smell hit me. It was thick shit that filled my nostrils, and as I looked around, saw that there was water coming from beneath Robert's cell. I ran and grabbed a towel, rolled it tight, and threw it against the cell door. Then I grabbed a second and a third, rolling each as tight as possible before jamming them against the crack. I opened the trap, the thick stink hitting me instantly. "Robert!" I yelled, but he was dancing with his back to me. "Robert, turn the shower off!" He either didn't hear me or refused to listen. He didn't turn, and he didn't turn the shower off. Thelma called out to me, and I closed the trap and went to her. "Soup's just tied up at the code. 3 crooks stabbed another crook. They reckon there's blood everywhere." I groaned, knowing that the lockdown would remain for most of the day. Once the scene was under control, the prison would remain in lockdown until the police had been and finished their own investigation. And that could take hours. A lot of hours. I looked back at the water still leaking through the towels. I went and grabbed a thick blanket, wound it up tight, and jammed it against the already soaked towels. It blocked it, but I knew it was only for a matter of time. Robert continued singing and dancing around his cell, the water continuing to rise, and I could see that it was above his ankles. The drain was still working to an extent, but nowhere near fast enough to stop it from flooding the hospital floor. Thelma called for the soup again, and he said he'd send someone with a key to the mains. But we were going to have an issue, and it was one I saw from a mile away. If he turned the water off to Robert's cell, how many other cells would it affect? And how would the nursing staff react to it? The other issue we had was that the prison was running at capacity. There was nowhere else for Robert to be taken, and even if the TOs would enter the cell, there was nothing to stop Robert from doing it again. It would appear that we were stuck with him. After about an hour, the shit-laced water began to leak through the blanket, the water slowly creeping across the linoleum floor. The depth of the water was a couple of inches as it worked its way around the unit. The smell was unbearable, with most people gagging. I can't begin to tell you just how bad the smell was. I'm almost convinced that as I sit here, writing this for you, I can still smell it. It turns out that the prisoner that was stabbed died within seconds of the attack. He was 27 and a father of 2 young children. He had drug debts that he tried to escape from, but even after being transferred to a protection unit, it wasn't enough to save him. The 3 prisoners that attacked him with shivs made from toothbrushes stabbed him 42 times. One officer tried to approach the gang during the attack, but one of them held the shiv up to him and told him to stay away. Officers aren't allowed to carry weapons of any sort, and thus all the unit officers could do was watch. When the TOs finally rushed in, they sprayed the group with capsicum spray and cuffed the attackers. They'd only taken 55 seconds to enter the unit from the initial call, but it was long enough for them to do the damage. All 3 were taken to separate units and held in holding cells. The police took a couple of hours to turn up and worked well into the night. The police interviewed each prisoner, then returned to the unit to continue their investigation. The deceased prisoner was removed from the prison just after 3, around the same time that someone finally turned up with a key to unlock the mains cabinet. We'd had a couple of prisoners mop the water up, and that had kept it to a minimum, but the smell was there to stay. No amount of air freshener would kill it. It was just after 6 that a psychiatric nurse finally turned up and talked Robert down. He agreed to take a cake of soap and wash the shit from his hair. He took his clothing from the drain and picked up any remaining pieces of shit and flushed them. He was handed a mop and bucket, and he cleaned his cell as best he could. By the time we finally walked out of the prison, our nasal passages feeling like they had been permanently scarred, Robert was asleep on his bunk. The smell in the unit remained. Today was definitely not a good day. Wednesday, August 22nd. I was sent back to the medical wing for another day, and much to my delight, saw Thelma and Ricky already in the station when I walked in. I don't know whether it was just my nose, but the smell from the previous day remained. There was, however, some good news. Robert had been moved to another unit during the night. According to the night shift officer, Robert began to get extremely abusive during the night and had smeared feces into the speaker grating of his intercom, rendering it useless. As prison protocol requires every cell to have a working intercom, and as there was no other available cells within the medical unit, Robert was moved into another unit. Let's just say that when the news was relayed to us, there may have been a couple of low-key high fives between us. We also found out that the police officers remained in the prison until nearly 1 a.m. The attack was caught on CCTV and was clear enough to identify each of the attackers. 2 of them had been long-termers, in for 15 and 22 years. But the third was a 21-year-old that was in for a minor break-and-enter. All 3 would now be facing murder charges. The day is pretty much a no event. Other than the usual rounds with the nurses, the day plods along as it normally does in a hospital. By the time we walk out, our noses have begun to lose the previous day's stench. It was a good day. Saturday, August 25th. I was rostered in Thompson East today. It can be quite a challenging unit to work in, and my nerves are eased slightly when I see my offsiders. One is Chris Upton, and the other is Toby Richards, a good friend of mine. Both officers have years of experience and are known to keep level heads when it comes to incidents. As I enter the unit, there is a code mic called by control. It's for Tambo East, and I find out later that the crook had been told by a night officer that he was being transferred to another jail this morning. A good way for crooks to prevent their transfer, particularly if they want to remain in their current abode, is to feign a medical issue. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. The prisoner in question actually ran at his cell wall and knocked himself out. He had accumulated extensive drug debts at his destination and really wanted to avoid the place. After being attended to by the medical staff, the crook was taken off the transfer list. The 3 of us talk shit for a few minutes as we prepare for the oncoming shift. Once our things are all stowed away, I grab the ligature knife and mustard sheet and follow Chris as he heads for the first cell. Toby is a regular in the unit and is already on the intercom with prisoners asking their usual morning questions. Questions like whether they're on the bus, whether they are transferring to another unit, available billet jobs, single cells that might be available, that kind of thing. Chris begins to drop traps and call out numbers to me. 1 if it's an occupied single cell, and 2 if it's a double. We finish the bottom tier and climb the stairs to the second tier when a prisoner begins banging on a cell door. It's the 3rd door along from us, and I follow Chris there. It's a 2-outer, and we find that one of the crooks has fallen off his bunk. His cellie tells us that he was having a seizure or something and rolled onto the floor, hitting his head. I call the code mic, and we wait for staff to arrive. It doesn't take long before a number of staff and the duty supervisor arrive. When they do, Chris cracks the cell and brings the upright prisoner out and gets him seated on a nearby chair. There's a fair bit of blood on the ground, and it appears as though the prisoner split his scalp. He is conscious, though, and when the medical staff enter the cell, they begin working on him immediately. Prisoner Sexton has a history of epilepsy, and staff suspect he had a seizure while up on his bunk and simply fallen to the floor. Several staff are asked to carry him out of the cell and onto the stretcher, while the duty supe calls control to order an ambulance. Sexton is stretchered back to the medical wing to await his ride into town. Once he's left the unit, control calls for the resumption of muster numbers, and Chris and I finish our count without further incident. Count is called correct a short time later, and our day begins with the unlocking of the unit. I'm halfway around the top tier when the supe calls out to me. I hadn't heard him come back into the unit, so I'm surprised when I see him standing at the station. He waves at me, gesturing for me to come to him, which I do. "Don't unlock 37, he said, leaning in close. I look at him curiously. Sexton had a stab wound in his back. They think he was attacked by a cellie. Let the rest out for the time being, and if need be, we can lock them down after. I do as he asks and unlock the rest of the top tier as Chris finished unlocking the bottom. When I return to the station, a few prisoners are already congregating and asking questions about why 37 remained locked. They are such a curious bunch. Because there's no actual footage, the investigation relies on statements from the prisoners involved. It doesn't surprise me to learn that Sexton is refusing to talk. It's not uncommon for crooks to keep tight-lipped, even when they're the victims. It's a prison code of thing, and if broken, can lead to much more serious repercussions. But our suspicions allow us to keep the prisoner locked down for the rest of the day. As I've said before, Saturdays have a very different feel about them. Apart from the excitement from the morning, the rest of the day is nothing but pure routine. I could write it down and tell you about the med trolley turning up, the gym time, meals, lunchtime muster, poker games, table tennis games, the laundry being done. But that's not what you're here for, is it? Sexton returns to the unit later in the day. His cellmate is eventually picked up by the TOs and transferred to another unit, with the matter pretty much closed due to neither crook talking. As far as we're concerned, today was a good day. Sunday, August 26th. Some days, you just know when you're going to have a crap day. Not necessarily an eventful day, just a crap one. Before you even set foot inside your work, the energy surrounding you is just screaming for you to turn around and go home. Today was one of those days. As soon as I arrived at work and saw that I was working with Tony Malone, I knew that I should have stayed in bed that morning. There had been an incident the previous night. Rats had managed to chew through some pretty important cables that provided power to the CCTV system. Every camera in the prison was on the fritz, and as the control room had no clue as what was happening around the jail, Tony and I were tasked with driving the perimeter security vehicle around the outside perimeter of the prison to ensure there was no one trying to climb over the fence and no contraband was thrown into the jail. It meant that I would be sitting in a car with someone that I not only had no respect for, but also had nothing in common with. We headed outside and located the security vehicle, a Ford Territory. I was lucky enough to be handed the keys and was more than happy to take the wheel. We would be doing nothing more than driving around in a big circle, watching for anyone approaching the massive concrete wall from the outside. Unfortunately for us, if anyone did want to get contraband over the wall, a drone would probably be the better option, especially since they have a range of up to 5 kilometers. The day wasn't exciting. There were no crazy car chases or us shooting drones from the sky. There were no escape attempts, and for the most part, I got to drive in silence, as my passenger decided to nap for most of the day. I didn't mind. For me, it meant that there were no uncomfortable silences and not much forced conversation. Today wasn't a bad day as such. It was just crap. Thursday, August 30th. It was a hectic day working in Murray South, which is one of the management units. I guess it depends on what you favor from a work environment that determines whether or not it's considered good or bad. Personally, I think it comes down to your own choices as well as the frame of mind with which you approach the workday. Today was busy. Very busy. Being a management unit means prisoners are locked down for up to 23 hours per day. They are entitled to a single 1-hour runout, which is normally in one of the 7 choke pens, scattered around the unit. Prisoners also receive their meals through their traps and have their laundry washed by unit staff. There are visits to facilitate, medication rounds, prisoners to be escorted to medical appointments and telecourt, as well as countless other things that come up. All the duties are handled at unit level and rely on 7 officers to share and complete. One officer normally runs the book, which means they don't move from their location unless urgently needed. Thelma is running the book today, and we also have Bob, Pete, Ricky, Chris, and Mario. Pete and Mario are regular officers in the unit, and we generally follow their instruction to ensure a smooth day. They are, after all, the brains of the outfit. As soon as count is called correct, Mario asks Chris and I to stock up the rations trolley, as today was rations day. It was also canteen day in the unit, which meant that at some point during the morning, a stores person would deliver 44 bags of shopping that each prisoner has ordered on their weekly shopping list. Once they are delivered, officers take each bag to the prisoner's trap and count each item out, ticking it off on the order form. Believe me when I say that if items are not counted out and marked off, every order will be missing items. Not that prisoners would ever take advantage of the system. Please, note my sarcasm. Once the trolley is filled with disposable razors, sugar rations, coffee rations, toothpaste, shaving cream, and toilet paper, Chris and I began going trap to trap, giving each prisoner their goods. Most seem pleasant enough despite their predicament and are happy to be topping up their supplies. One prisoner refuses to come to the trap, and we close it and move on. When we're done, we stow the trolley back where it came from and return to the station. Bob and Pete are busy escorting the first of the runouts, and Mario is busy planning the 3 visits that are scheduled for the unit. The visits are held within the unit, in a side room which houses both contact and non-contact visit booths. Chris and I go and help escort prisoners to their designated choke pens. Another aspect of working in the management unit is the constant burning of prisoners, or staff, depending on the prisoners doing the burning. Today seems to be Pick on Murray Day, because they haven't stopped yelling abuse at Murray Toomey, a protection prisoner that was brought into the unit the previous day. He has a history of lagging on other crooks, particularly those that he owes drug debts to. As Chris and I escort our first prisoner to his choke pen, Bob and Pete pass us to grab their next crook. They wait until ours is safely locked away, then go to the cell and begin the process. The prisoner has some rubbish he wants to throw into the bin on his way past, and Bob gives him the okay. It was all going so well until the crook was a few feet ahead of his escort. It was all the space he needed, and he seemed to move with such incredible speed that it was all over by the time I registered what had happened. Although the hooting from the other prisoners was enough confirmation that Watson had succeeded in whatever he had planned. He'd been carrying a rubbish bag, supposedly filled with rubbish. When he was a few feet ahead of his escorts, he reached into the bag, pulled out a milk carton, and threw the bag behind him, temporarily slowing the officers walking behind him. He then ran at full speed to Murray's cell, wedged one side of the milk carton underneath the cell door, finally jumping on the carton with all his might. I can only imagine the resulting stream of piss and shit that shot underneath the door, covering everything in the cell with a thin coat of nastiness. The ensuing scream of horror, followed by the distinct choke of dry retching, is what set the rest of the unit off in a gale of laughter and loud cheers, their cries of jubilation echoing across the unit. Some began to bang their cell doors with fists and boots in a unified cheer of victory. Inside the cell, Murray began to vomit. Murray had been sitting on the floor cross-legged and folding some washing that had been handed to him. He was facing the door and had virtually no time to react once he realized what was about to happen. The mixture of piss and shit that was jettisoned under his door was a direct hit, striking the crook directly in the face. He told us after that a little had squirted into his mouth and he needed to see the nurse. We all understood his concern, although he didn't appreciate the new nickname the unit had bestowed upon him, Shitstorm. The shit bomber ended up losing his runout and was transferred to another unit. Although he did walk out with his chin held high, the other crooks giving him a farewell parade of cheers. Murray was taken to another cell and allowed to shower, a new uniform handed to him. Once he was cleaned, He was taken to the medical wing for some tests and then returned to his cell to begin the cleanup. The visits were all finished by 2 o'clock, and once the last of the escorts was finished, Chris and I went trap to trap to dispense the canteen. An almighty roar erupted when the crooks saw the shopping bags, their weekly sugar fixes now only moments away. It's a relatively simple task, and there are only a couple of genuine mistakes which we mark off and subsequently report back to stores. The missing items are usually delivered the next day if they're in stock, or credited if they aren't. The day comes to an end when Control calls for a lockup count, and Mario does a brief handover to the night shift officer. As we walk out of the prison, I actually appreciate the busy day. It passed with relative speed, some humor, and some new experiences. Today was a good day. Friday, August 31st. It's the last day of the month, and unlike a sales job trying to reach its monthly target, the day has no real significance to us in prison. Dates only have a meaning to those that are serving time, as a date may mean their release, back into the arms of their loved ones. Today, I'm rostered in the Sallyport. This is the big roller door you see from the outside, and is a giant airlock that has roller doors at either end, which are controlled from a fortified control room. Its main purpose is to act as a safe entry and exit point for vehicles such as transport buses and trucks. Both roller doors cannot be opened at the same time. It's also where supervisors will walk prisoners through as they are being discharged. Usually, this part of the prison is operated by the control room staff as well as 2 officers directly in the Sallyport. My offsider today is Ross Newton, a control room regular. Ross has been at the prison for almost a dozen years and is quite friendly to work with. The workload in the Sallyport comes in peaks and troughs. As each vehicle enters, we wait for the roller door to lower, then give the vehicle a thorough once-over. A heartbeat monitor is attached to it, and once activated, we wait for it to come up negative, a process that takes around 30 seconds. We also climb into each cabin to ensure no contraband is brought inside. Cell phones or iPads usually remain in the Sallyport and are locked inside temporary lockers. Other than discharging prisoners, there is virtually no prisoner contact in here. Occasionally we might hear 1 or 2 try and yell something at us from within the transport buses, but it's usually too muffled to make out. There's a logbook to maintain, as well as confirming the correct numbers of prisoners that enter and exit the prison, the number of which we pass on to the control room staff. There isn't really any particular drama that happens in this part of the prison. The work is usually completed with relative ease, and we greet each driver with a smile and a handshake. But, being the last day of the month, I was glad for one final story that I could share with you. Something to make you smile as we come to the end of the book. At around 3:30, a prisoner was brought up by the duty soup. He'd served 2.5 years for burglary and had finished his sentence. Usually, the process for a discharge is that they are brought into the Sallyport, and one of us will identify the prisoner. His details are entered into the logbook, and then, much to his and his family's excitement, the outer roller door is raised, and he runs out into the arms of his family, who are anxiously waiting on the other side. And most of the time, we are happy to see them leave. But every so often, a prisoner arrives who you just wish would suffer a little bit of karma. We could hear the crook giving the soup quite a bit of stick from beyond the inner roller door. "Can we walk faster, Fanso?" I heard him tell the soup, a lovely man by the name of Phil Hansen. Phil was the kind of man that always had a kind word to say, no matter who you were. He always smiled and he was always friendly, greeting everyone with a warm handshake and a smile. He was a little on the larger side as he limped, the leg injury from a long-ago motorcycle accident. "For fuck's sake, can we get there today? I got places to be," he added. There was a loud banging on the roller door as the crook smashed his fist against it. "Come on, let's go!" As the roller door began to wind up, we could see the pair come into view from the feet up. The prisoner was dressed in Nike runners, a pair of black jeans and a black t-shirt that had a woman in a bikini printed on it. A sharp-dressed guy, you could say. As they entered the sally port, Phil came to me, shook my hand, and asked me how I was. Yeah, let's go, the crook continued. Painful? I asked Phil, and he smiled at me, his grin growing wider. Not for much longer, mate. There was a twinkle in his eye that made me a little curious, but I took the paperwork to confirm the prisoner's identity. I held the page up, compared the photo, and asked him his name. Already been through this like a dozen fucking times, he began, but I dropped the paper to my side and just looked at him. After almost a minute, he finally got the idea. Name, I repeated. Mitchell Lawson, he replied, and after I asked him a few other questions, confirmed his ID. I turned to the control room window. One out, I shouted, and just as the roller door began to retract slowly up into the ceiling, Phil shot me a wink that, at the time, seemed to match his Cheshire grin. The prisoner wore a huge smirk and began to walk towards the opening. Just as he reached the boundary between the sally port and outside world, he turned back to us, shot us the bird with both hands, and began to cackle with laughter. The soup would normally turn and leave at this point, but Phil stood his ground, that Cheshire grin never faltering, instead growing wider. Later, fuckers, the crook called back to us, then turned and began to walk out. At that exact moment, 4 police officers rounded the corner and surrounded the crook. Mitchell Lawson? One asked. He nodded, the humor draining from his face. I'm Constable Riley. This is Constable Smith and Constable Jackson from the New South Wales Police, and they have an outstanding warrant for you. Put your hands out in front of you. The laughter that I heard come from Phil, who was standing beside me, filled me like autumn sunshine. The 3 of us stood there as we watched karma work its magic. He'd had an outstanding warrant for assaulting his pregnant girlfriend, but had fled to Queensland before they were able to execute it. Once he was apprehended and charged here, the warrant was put in waiting, ready to be used once he was released from prison. Seeing the look on his face still makes me smile as I write this. It was a funny thing to witness, and a story I will surely share many times. When I finished my shift a couple of hours later, I reminded myself of just where I worked, a maximum security prison, a place that really did provide a different experience with every single working day. Today was a fantastic day.